I've been very, very fortunate myself to have Christine next to me managing this whole technological wonder. And it's a privilege, especially now at this time, to introduce Tom's daughter, Christine, to you for a time of remembrance and then a time of sharing about Tom.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Christine, Tom's youngest daughter. I want to start off by thanking everyone who joined us this morning to celebrate my father's beautiful life. I know Zoom was a new communication platform for several of you, so congratulations, you made it here with us. Sorry, just thank you. My dad and I certainly didn't always see eye to eye on everything. And actually, when it came to politics, we didn't see eye to eye on many things. We debated literally constantly, but we always came to the table with a sense of mutual love, admiration, and respect for one another that not many people can seem to understand in these divisive times. He was truly one of a kind. There are so many stories I want to share about my dad, but it was hard to narrow it down to just a few. I feel truly fortunate because my dad was incredibly involved in raising me. He was the one with me when I took my first steps and learned to tie my shoes. For a time during my early childhood, he was unemployed. My preschool and kindergarten only went for half days, so I would be able to spend my early mornings with my dad until I had to go to school in the afternoon. My mom was working full-time at a local gas station, and Dad would drag me around to see his friends at the car shop. We'd go fishing and rabbit hunting. We'd watch Jeopardy, Sesame Street, The Art Maker with Dan Mahuta, and of course, Mr. Rogers. We'd go visit my mom at the gas station and eat Dad's homemade rabbit chicken for lunch. I continue to swear by the fact that spending this much time with my dad in my formative years is what made me into the person I am today, and I am forever grateful for those years. Eventually, my dad got a job working in the maintenance department for the hospital in Brookfield. This job came about while I was in kindergarten, and in May of that year, I became ill at school. I was running an extremely high temperature of around 104 or 105. My sister Kim came to pick me up at school and tried to get my temperature down, but eventually she and my mom took me to the hospital. My dad met me outside the emergency room and carried me in. I ended up spending about 2 weeks in the hospital. Neither of my parents could afford to take off work, but since my dad worked at the hospital, he tried to use that to his advantage. He spent an inordinate amount of time mowing the lawn, trimming the hedges, and pulling at the weeds outside my hospital room window, where he would peer in and wave at me. He would eat his lunch in my room. He would send his other buddies in the maintenance department to check on me, and he would come in immediately after work and watch Jeopardy with me on the small hospital room television. He cared so much about his children and grandchildren and would do anything for us. Watching Mr. Rogers was one of the very last things I talked about with my dad. When he was admitted to the VA hospital on December 9th, he was extremely sick. Before he was intubated, he sent me this text message. I forgot to scroll through my own slide, so this is my dad in his maintenance uniform for the hospital. And this is the last text conversation I had, one of the last text conversations I had with my dad. Before he was intubated later that afternoon, he sent me this text to let me know he was watching A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, the 2019 film about Mr. Rogers starring Tom Hanks. Coincidentally, I happened to be wearing a t-shirt with Mr. Rogers on it at my house in Zimbabwe. So I texted him a picture of me in the shirt and told him it was a sign and that I loved him. And that was the last discussion we ever had. I wish the spirit of Mr. Rogers could have helped him pull through. One weekend in 2007, my dad called on the phone to tell me that Senator John McCain would be in Kansas City promoting his new book called Hard Call. This was before the 2008 presidential primaries, and it appeared that Senator McCain would likely be a top contender for the 2008 Republican presidential nomination. My dad was a big fan of Senator McCain and was encouraging me to go to the book signing event. He didn't want to drive down to the big city and didn't like crowded events, so he was pushing me to go on his behalf. I reluctantly agreed and called up a friend of mine to go with me. At the end of the event, the senator remained behind to sign copies of his book. My friend and I hatched a plan to ask the senator if he would call my dad, a Vietnam veteran like himself, on the phone. When we got to the front of the line, I nervously asked if he would mind calling my dad. To my surprise, the senator immediately took my phone out of my hands, dialed my dad's number. My dad picked up on the other end. John McCain said, "Hi, Tom, this is John McCain. Thank you for serving our country, my friend." My dad immediately freaked. He was both emotional and stunned. He and the senator talked for about 5 minutes. When the senator handed my phone back, my dad was crying. It was a moment that meant so much to both of us over the years, and we would talk about this story on several occasions when we would meet. Now, if you've ever ridden in the car with my dad, which I know many of you have, you know he literally drove everywhere like he was John Force. He was the master of defensive driving, and it was rather intimidating when he teaches you how to drive. Most of us kids and his grandkids have stories about learning to drive from my dad. When I turned 15 in 2000, I got my permit. Dad's driving school scared the hell out of my mom so much that she threatened to never ride in a car with me again. I got my license shortly after I turned 16, and my dad helped me to buy a zippy little white Buick Regal. One of my first weekends driving on my own, I went to Macon and got pulled over doing 84 and a 65, which is a misdemeanor speeding charge in Missouri. You can look it up on Missouri CaseNet. It's still on my criminal record all these years later. I drove the rest of the way home bawling, fearful of the repercussions that would await me at home. My parents weren't home when I arrived. I sat on the sofa with my keys and my driver's license in my hand, anxiously awaiting my punishment. Dad came in and I told him the story, complete with tears and apologies and offers to never drive again. My dad listened to my spiel intently and then busted out laughing until he was almost in tears. He said, "What kind of hypocrite would I be if I took your car and license for speeding? But just know you are going to pay that ticket and deal with the repercussions yourself." Paying that ticket took 1.5 paychecks from my job at the local Sonic drive-in. Over the past month that my dad was hospitalized, I found myself missing something else about him that I never thought I would. My dad was an early riser, like early, like waking up at 4:30 or 5 a.m. every single day early. And that is okay. But the problem with my dad was that his inner drill sergeant believed that everyone else should be an early riser too. If you weren't, he would make as much noise as humanly possible to ensure that you'd be awake soon too. Coming home to visit, it would drive me absolutely insane because at 5 a.m. every single morning, he would be out in the living room, stomping around so loudly that the walls would rattle, with the TV on Fox News blaring in the background. Nothing gives me more nightmares than the sound of Fox and Friends that early in the morning. By 5:30 a.m., the entire house was wide awake and ready for breakfast. But only a few short hours later, my dad would be asleep in the recliner with a remote in his hand and a John Wayne Western on the TV, only to awaken grumpily into a mini rage when a Medicare commercial would disturb his slumber. There is nothing that my father hated more than the number of medical commercials on the Western Channel. On a final note, I would not be Tom Clark's daughter if I didn't take an opportunity to lecture and share my opinions. Losing my dad to COVID-19 has been particularly difficult for me. Not only because we were tremendously close, but because I have spent my entire career working in public health to prevent senseless deaths like his. I talk to my dad constantly about this pandemic since it started. Dr. Birx, the White House COVID Task Force Coordinator, or the Scarf Lady, as she is lovingly referred to on social media, was my former boss. This felt very close to me. My dad would go to the restaurant uptown and other places around Marceline, bragging about me and parading a picture of me with Dr. Birx around to anyone that would listen. I know he was proud of me. I just wish so much that he and others in Marceline would take COVID-19 more seriously. Because honestly, since I've been back, it's very obvious that people do not care. My dad might still be here if he did. Please wear a mask and follow the guidelines for social distancing. Get vaccinated when you can. My sister is a nurse, and she received her first dose of the Moderna vaccine the afternoon before our dad passed away. I know, especially after everything he went through, he would be so proud of her. I want to end here and transition to the next part of our program. I'm not sure if many people knew this, but my dad was actually working on a little autobiography, sharing some of the tall tales and stories of his youth. He was inspired by an uncle who did the same before his passing. Dad recounted several of these stories on Facebook over the years, and I want to share a quote from him. He says, "I have seen so many posts reflecting sadness and grief over a lost friend or loved one that everyone has or will experience at some time in their life. I lost my mother several years ago, and any time I think about her, I remember the time she had us all cranking an old ice cream maker for hours and hours, only to find out she forgot to put the paddles in it, not once, but twice, and her embarrassment over that. Whenever we gathered to make homemade ice cream after that, the first question we would always ask is, did you put the paddles in? And she would become embarrassed all over again. Even on that day, she was laid to rest. We told stories that made us laugh, and that experience has provided many laughs since." I'm sure that story probably sounds familiar to many of you. We all know he loved to tease, sometimes relentlessly. I want to open the floor now and provide an opportunity for people to share their favorite memories or stories about my dad. You can use the Zoom feature to raise your hand so that we can call on you to unmute, or you can type and share memories into the chat and we'll read them aloud. Thank you.